All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. So we're here today to talk about governance, not the fluffy kind, the paradigm-shifting, messy, make-or-break layer of decentralized systems. And lucky for me, I'm joined by the sharpest minds in the space, Jaya, Bill, and Angela. So let's get to it. First of all, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Are these systems working? Is what we were hoping for, is the utopian vision being met? Jaya, why don't you start us off? Do you think we've nailed it, or do you think we've got a long way to go?
Yeah, I mean, today I think we can look back at a couple of years of decentralized governance, and we have learned that many things didn't work out as expected. One issue is that we were assuming that everybody is super happy to participate in decentralized governance. That's not the case. And there's another issue, I think, that also is a strong learning, that the assumption was that participation in decentralized governance means together we grow the value of an ecosystem. But we learned that the opposite is maybe the case. If we look at numbers on governance proposals and tokens who are voting, then the vast majority of proposals with token activity are about governance changes, voting policies, tokenomics, supply, about grants and builder rewards. So it's not exactly about growing the value, it's rather the opposite, it's extracting value. And this is, of course, something that has to be addressed. I think aligning incentives in governance is something very important, also efficiency. But I think we are at a stage where we also see a shift in building appropriate infrastructure, addressing particular decision spaces. So what has to be decided here? What's the best mechanism? And some very interesting new developments when it comes to integrating data, AI, evidence in decision making. So I'm still positive about decentralized governance.
This is good. This is what we want to hear, right? Optimism is the way forward. But I suppose one of the issues as well is that it can't be a one-size-fits-all sort of approach, right? Different ecosystems, I think sometimes we find, and Bill, you're going to be someone, you're in the weeds every single day, right? You're someone who's kind of experiencing these shifts and having to potentially pivot sometimes, right? So what's your experience of it? The design that maybe you had mapped out, or at least you had seen, how has that kind of come to life or not come to life?
Yeah, so I think, sort of continuing on what Angela said, I think what people are interested in on-chain governance isn't always what we thought they were going to be interested in. A lot of the examples that I remember giving, actually here at Web3 Summit in 2019, I gave a talk on governance in Kusama, before Kusama had launched, was technical details. Changes to the protocol, changes to administrative changes. And what we see actually is that isn't what always people are interested. We see lots of votes about tokenomics. We see lots of bike shedding about things that people have very high-level ideas about and don't go into the weeds. And so I think that we are seeing governance actually doing some very, very important things. But I also think we need to do more to understand what people want to do in governance, what they're capable of doing, and what makes them want to participate in governance, and not try to put our ideas, right, as maybe perhaps the people here are probably more ideological than the average person. They're probably also more technical, and so sometimes if we want governance to work, we need to understand what the average person is interested in deciding via governance.
Yeah, and Jaya, do you agree? Are you still optimistic about how we can evolve things, how we can respond?
I think maybe I was never optimistic, if I'm honest.
Look, that's why.
I was maybe one of the people kind of that had a little bit of a kind of critical perspective on some of the ideas around on-chain governance from very early on in the days. Mainly because many times, like on-chain governance kind of skirts around some of the deeper and more difficult problems around politics and around disagreement and around power, fundamentally. So I think one of the interesting things, but I do think that governance is important, and I do think that on-chain does something interesting. Yeah, maybe like one of the things that I would be keen to kind of see a little bit more of is exactly understanding kind of the power dynamics between different actors that are engaging in distributed governance. So almost like understanding the constituents a little bit clearer. So, you know, and I say this kind of like maybe also just taking a little bit of a bigger perspective where, you know, there's problems with governance, not just in terms of like decentralized protocols, but let's say full stop in the world right now, right? And like understanding, you know, what makes people want to participate in governance, I think is a question of whether people feel like the governance process is where power is actually enacted. If it's not, then why are you participating, right? And that's, I think, maybe a little bit the kind of, you know, the darker side of kind of looking at big picture governance in the world today is that, you know, institutional frameworks are breaking down and so on and so forth. So I think having an understanding of like, in how to empower actors, and empowerment is not about empowering an individual necessarily, but empowering people understanding where their shared interests lie so that they can actually organize better around that. So, and there I mean like, you know, like what's interesting about kind of decentralized protocols and distributed systems is it almost kind of like bypasses the question of power because the assumption is that, well, it's distributed. Right. You know, what question of power, right? But actually, when you look closer, it's like, well, you know, you've got, you know, founders, and you've got investors, and you've got whales, and you've got, you know, validators, and I think that question of kind of what are these different actors in the kind of ecosystems that we've been building, what are their differences and interests, and how can those be negotiated in meaningful ways that don't try and skirt around the question of power?
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the degrees of decentralization point is really interesting as well, right? Because you see such a vast range. You know, some ecosystems want to put everything on chain. They're like, okay, let's put the treasury, let's do everything. Other ecosystems are more conservative in their approach to governance. Now, bonus points if you don't talk about an ecosystem who has paid you in the past. But do you see any particular projects doing this really well? Have you seen anything where you think the governance model has a lot of promise, or people kind of driving those efforts that you would call out?
Absolutely. There are several. So I mentioned the alignment of interests and incentives in the context of governance. So in the past, we tried to encourage voters to participate. But in fact, if a voter invests in assessing a proposal, this takes time and effort, and we want to have voters who take an educated decision. But so far, they invested to the benefit of everyone, because every token holder potentially participates in the success of the network and maybe value accrue of the token. Now, for incentivizing good decisions, and at the same time, also provide downsides for bad decisions. At the moment, in most governance mechanisms, we don't have any way to approach this question. How can we align incentives of voters and the wider ecosystem? So this is a classical principal agent problem. A huge group of stakeholders, token holders, builders of applications, liquidity providers, etc. Trust and hand over power to voters, agents, and we have to make sure that these incentives are aligned. Now, we seeing currently really exciting experiments on voter skin in the game. So how can we provide upsides and downsides based on the quality of decisions? There's currently an interesting experiment going on with Butter, and they call it conditional funding markets, where we have bets on the future success and contribution to TVL growth on Unichain. Or a similar experiment have been run at Optimism. Prediction markets trying to predict the future success of projects and define the funding invested in these projects. And early results of these experiments show that the projects selected by the prediction market perform 5 times better than the project selected by the Grants Council. So it seems that we can find interesting mechanisms to make voters participate in the success and benefit from good decisions. And this might help us to attract experts, attract the right experts for taking decisions where expertise is really relevant, and generally activate tokens in the voting process in governance.
Okay. Bill?
Yeah, I really think it's too early to say if anyone's doing a truly good job.
Okay.
As you mentioned, we have some projects like Polkadot, which has gone in a very on-chain direction, where all decisions are made on-chain, where the treasury is on-chain. We have others, like Bitcoin, where it's basically okay, you fork or you don't fork, and those are your governance decisions. And we are I think we're still figuring out what works and what goes on-chain. We're still learning a lot, and I can see, when I look at, I'm not an expert in every single system out there, but I see some interesting things happening in Polkadot. I see some interesting things happening Cardano's ecosystem, which is much more, they've got a very different approach that's also relatively complex and full. But I do think that we're figuring these things out. I think we really are still in this phase, the sort of, I think back to the Cambrian era, where there's all these sort of weird body forms being originated and evolving, and things are failing in very interesting and weird ways. And I think we're in that phase right now, that we are still experimenting. And even Bitcoin's only 16 years old at this point, and I know that 1 year in the blockchain world is 10 years in any other industry, but that's still not a very long period of time for us to figure out what really works. I think we're still in the process of figuring out what will work in the long run.
Yeah, so we're at the nascent stages still, and it's a kind of feedback loop that we have to constantly be adapting and listening and informing as well, right? Because there's that kind of human motivation element as well, right? Do your motivations match with what the project needs and all of these sort of things?
Yeah, which is not always the case. I thought that was a really a good point you made, Angela, in your first thing, that a lot of decisions in the early days were non-extractive, and now if you're voting for treasuries especially, this is a really difficult area, because often your incentives are not aligned with the broader network. And so it's very difficult. We've definitely been trying different things to do it, but this alignment of incentives among everybody is something very difficult to do on-chain, I think.
Yeah, and we'll come back to some of those mechanisms that you talked about in a second, because I know that you've done some cool and interesting work there. Jaya, what about yourself? Do you agree with your...
So I think the question was whether there's successful protocols.
Yeah, or have you seen elements of governance that you think, that's not too shabby?
Well, I think one of the most successful governance protocols, full stop, is hands down, and here we're stepping out of the tokenized realm, but Git, basically. That's what we effectively all use day to day for governance, but people just don't really pay attention to it. So that would be my answer. I think it's super successful.
Yeah.
Yep.
And would you use that as a framework potentially when we're?
I think it's being used default as a framework for governing code bases. That's just a fact, right? And then it doesn't, necessarily look like a kind of typical tokenized voting system in any way whatsoever. But it's doing the job in a certain way. Can that be expanded in interesting ways? I'm sure it can. Maybe there are people that are experimenting with that already.
It's great, because I'm sure there's lots of people sitting here going, oh yeah, I didn't even, of course. Duh. So yeah, no, very, very interesting. All right, let's talk about some of the mechanisms, Bill, that you brought up. So tell us a bit about kind of, obviously, like I said, you're in the weeds day to day. What are some of the things that maybe have not worked and you have found, maybe not fixes, but you've been what are the kind of pivots that you've made or kind of hacks that you've made to try and rebalance things?
So Yeah, so
Not to put you on the spot.
okay, yeah, so I wasn't sure yet to whom you were referring. So I can say, like Polkadot specifically, we have gone from a sudo governance, so think of like Git only with one person with the commit bit that can add anything or change anything, to gov1, which was a bit more complex. We had voted in council, we had a technical committee that could change lengths of voting periods, to now with OpenGov, where it's 1.1 vote. And we see problems with that too. I think every time, like, I always feel sort of perhaps academic because I always want to say, well, there's advantages and disadvantages to everything we've changed. We've seen problems with, having, we had a technical committee, we had people voted into a council, and we saw problems with that, with sort of centralization. And now with 1.1 vote for essentially every decision on Polkadot, we see problems with that. Too many decisions being made by too many people. Governance fatigue is a big issue of like having to deal with all of this stuff, not being able to focus on things. And so we then make changes there. So we now have bounties, which allow you to have like particular areas that you focus on, events, marketing, games, etc. And then you have fewer people, but then you have problems there with like a small group of people making decisions again. There's always in on-chain governance, I think this tension between effectiveness, which often a small number of people can be quite effective and fast and turn around, versus decentralization and representation. I think we see this in like in traditional governance as well, right? Democracies would take much longer to make a decision as opposed to a benevolent dictator. But there's also downsides to even a benevolent dictator. And so I think I made this sort of evolution analogy earlier, that we're still in the sort of the Cambrian or pre-Cambrian phase. And I think that's really good because we are evolving. Like we're seeing things that work and then make a change, and we see we're constantly adjusting. I feel like anyone that says sort of from Platonic first principles, this is how governance should work on chain or in the real world, is sort of fooling themselves, that they are trying to do too much based on too little foundation.
Yeah, and I mean, Angela, same experience. Do you feel like we're adjusting well enough? Like, I mean, Jaya, I feel like you're like, oh, not so sure, but like, are you like, have you kind of, do you believe that communities are able to pivot and adapt, that they're responding well to that? Because I don't know, I get the sense sometimes that once you're in it, you get quite attached to it potentially. Like, I don't know, I've kind of seen that, and it's hard to then, move in the right direction, especially if the incentives are misaligned.
I mean, a very important point is to be able to measure the results of a new governance mechanism and prove that a certain mechanism turns out to be more appropriate for the general success of a network. And this starts with defining what is success for us and what's the purpose, mission. And another great example when it gets to funding, ecosystem funding, valuable projects or applications, grow the network and the network value, is rethinking governance in a sense that we are moving at different speeds. So we have two streams. One are the preferences of the community, preferences of voters, which typically we collect in a voting process. And here we rely on the wisdom of the crowd. We think that many different perspectives will allow us to innovate faster, to be more dynamic when it comes to observing the space, to adapt to a changing environment. Individual preferences on one side. On the other side, when it comes to funding value add, we can integrate evidence. So we can integrate data about certain contributions. It can be to typical measures like metrics like TVL, active users, transactions, fees generated, etc. And this is about measuring data and observing and be transparent about what matters as a value add, and also how this is measured, what actually counts. And by merging those two, we can solve transparency issues. We can solve, or at least address, voter bias and collusion. so that the preferences move at a slower speed, where we define at a 6-month, 12-month cycles. What's the key goals? What are the key objectives? How can we measure these objectives? This is what counts. Slow voting cycles. And at a higher speed, we can define the how much in funding distribution by measuring these metrics and merging those two in one algorithm to execute on funds distribution, for example, allows us to scale decision making and also to make it more transparent and less biased. And these are some of the examples where we can, in fact, rethink governance, apply new mechanisms. We need infrastructure, of course, to defend metrics, to protect them, make them not gameable, etc. But this is, I think, this new era of governance. While in the past few years, we have been discussing what is power, what is decentralization, who's eligible to vote, etc. What are the voices that need to be heard? We are now shifting to efficiency and evidence, and what's needed, how to make the most of technology, and what is the actual objective for a particular governance vertical like funding.
Right. And with that data-driven approach, right, evidence, all of these things kind of like driving that, you've brought up a really interesting point, which is abuse of the system, right? That they're potentially, without those things, there is abuse of the system. And I'm not saying that you might agree that that's something that can happen, but is that why you're more pessimistic about governance more generally? Do you believe that kind of motivations of bad actors are still at the stage? Are these systems too open to abuse currently? Are they not well defined enough to be able to?
I'm kind of so the term bad actors kind of. I'm less interested in kind of bad actors versus good actors in this sort of kind of setup. I'm more interested in the affordances of specific forms of governance. So, and what's unique about kind of, tokenized governance versus other bits of governance is that there's economic value that somehow is tied very closely together to that political participation in a sense. And I guess I've been both very curious to see how that kind of plays out, but also very skeptical about that close connection, exactly because, you look at a system like that and the affordances that, one would naturally think would come with it is that there's suddenly an economic value tied up in becoming a bad actor and trying to game the system. Right. And that there's a different set of interests that come into play into the kind of decision making that's happening that are kind of more economic interests rather than other interests, and that can have interesting uses for sure. But it also opens up a kind of whole load of complicated problems. So I'd say that was some of my kind of early thinking very early on, both that and then also this idea that by committing things to a chain, you can kind of get rid of a lot of the messiness that comes along with negotiating power dynamics and so on and so forth. That was a bit the kind of naive early days version of what on-chain governance looks like. A lot has happened since then, and I'm personally super curious to sit here with you guys and hear what's been going on since then, because I also have to admit that my attention has been slightly elsewhere, so less focused on kind of how governance is maturing within the Web3 space and more looking at the kind of bigger picture of how governance is unfolding and politics is unfolding geopolitically, and also NIM's role in that, because we build strong privacy software, and our position is that is the kind of foundation for healthy democracy, really. So my thinking has been a little bit outside of the mechanics that I think some of the other panelists have been working on much more hands-on, and that I'm super curious about.
Yeah. So tell us, Bill, what have you seen from the beginning to now?
Yeah. So and actually, I think what you just said, that privacy is sort of a key point to all of this, is really true. That one of the problems I think we've seen in many governance systems, I've seen it in Polkadot, but also in other places, is that because votes are public, or very easy to tell if an account, X has been associated with one entity or something, they often are not willing to express their true beliefs in terms of voting, right? Which makes sense. I know that if my friend wants to has a really bad governance referendum, like I'm going to feel bad if my Bill account votes against them, even if I think it's a bad idea. I mean, this is why we see in real governance systems, right? I don't know who you voted for in your last whatever your presidential election or whatever, and I shouldn't know that. It allows us to make better decisions, and so I think that adding more privacy into these governance decisions on chain is going to be a huge, huge, huge win in terms of actually making better decisions. And that's sort of getting back to what you said, what is a better decision? But I do think we need privacy really to have democracy. Otherwise, if you have that panopticon on you, it's very difficult to actually make what you think is the right decision.
Yeah, and like you said, there's lobbying and social pressure and all of these kind of things that we maybe didn't initially consider that come to the fore. So yeah, definitely. What about you, Angela? What have you seen in terms of the evolution?
I mean, we have to acknowledge that what we are building today in DAOs and DAO governance is really a fundament for open democratic systems, organizations across the globe. And I think we are early stage, and we should address the issues really openly, like being biased, collusion, voter attacks. I mean, I never expected that in the DAO space we simply wouldn't find the exact same problems than in any other democracy. And we are learning that we simply have to tackle the exact same problems. So it's not that we are living in a new universe. It's rather that we have just new opportunities to address these challenges. And we have, DAOs are the first organizations that are entirely run on digital infrastructure. So the protocols themselves, the applications and transactions, so where value creation happens. Decision-making powers in form of tokens. A reputation and trust is also encoded and trackable. A track record in decision-making, even though during decision-making it might be good to have it private, but then what entities or token holders have been doing in the past might play a role for future decision-making as well, and the rewards I mentioned, the skin in the game, etc. So we have many of the ingredients to form new decision-making systems and still have them open and not creating boundaries and all kinds of whitelisting and blocking those who are eligible to vote. But to maintain this openness of systems, we have to find new solutions. And again, I think today it's about efficiency, it's about making voting systems resilient, but then from there, it's just we are living already in the digital space with decision-making. From here, we can apply AI to get to better decisions. We can monitor what's going on in our systems. We can, steer a whole ecosystem in a totally new way. And I think that's something that is really huge. And I think we are just on a journey.
Yeah, no, we absolutely are. And it's a journey with ups and downs, but it's exciting and it's important to be part of. We're almost out of time, which is awful because I could ask you 700 more questions. But what I'd like to do is ask you to address the audience. What is one thing that everyone in here on some level is involved in governance, whether that's as a participant, whether it's designing governance systems. What would your ask be to this group of people in terms of how they are interfacing with these systems and how they're thinking about these systems? No pressure. Bill, you can start.
Yeah. So I would say actually a recommendation I would give to everyone, especially if you've already been involved in governance, is try some other governance mechanism. Because if you are only used to using one governance mechanism, you're not going to learn about what are the benefits and disadvantages of other things. You're not going to bring those ideas back to whatever your home ecosystem is or whatever you're doing. And I think that's one of the benefits is that of on-chain governance is that we can change. And the only way we're going to really change is if we learn from others who are also doing it.
Awesome.
It's a difficult question, I have to say. But
I like to finish on a
yeah. Like, maybe, I mean, this is just something I'm personally thinking about. This concept of community, right? Sounds very fluffy, sounds very nice. But a community is, there's all kinds of different people in a community with all kinds of different interests. And I guess kind of what I've been trying to understand a little bit better is what precisely we mean by community and how the community in various ways wants to start to self-identify as interest groups, right? So, if we say everybody who holds a token is part of a community, okay, but how many tokens? Is it maybe like small holders are their own form of interest group versus like larger whales or mid-scale holders? Is there some sort of like overlap? And the reason why I find this interesting and important is because that's when you start to touch a little bit more on the question of power and what shared interests you have and how you can actually build power as a community vis-a-vis whatever else is going on in the ecosystem. Yeah, that's kind of like, I guess, some of the thoughts that I've been having.
Yeah, awesome. Angela?
I would encourage everyone to be loud in case you see problems. I think the most valuable contribution as a DAO member is not stay on the surface discussing philosophical questions at a meta level, rather dig into dig into the numbers, observe the system, monitor what's going on. I think this is a super valuable contribution because it pushes innovation in the governance space and ultimately will make any ecosystem, any network better, any protocol better.
Amazing. So go on a tour, think about your community, and keep building, get involved, roll up your sleeves. Please help me in thanking our amazing panel. Thank you. All right, thank you.